The cold metal handcuffs bit into my wrists as I stood on my own front porch, watching Sheriff Karen flip my steaks on my grill. The smoke from my barbecue mixed with the flashing red and blue lights as her deputies treated me like a common criminal. My neighbors watched from across the fence as she laughed with her friends, drinking my beer and eating my food. The radio crackled as dispatch confirmed my arrest for threatening a police officer on my own property. That was when I realized this was no accident. I had worked 32 years to buy that ranch. Every morning I woke up to the sound of meadowlarks singing in the oak trees that lined my property. The land stretched out for 40 acres of rolling hills and green pastures, with a creek that ran clear and cold through the back section. My house sat on a small rise, surrounded by the kind of peace that money cannot buy. The neighbors knew me as the quiet guy who kept to himself but always helped when someone needed a hand. When old Mrs. Henderson's fence went down in a storm, I spent my weekend putting it back up. When the Martinez family needed help moving their cattle, I was there with my truck and trailer. That was how small towns worked. We looked out for each other. I had built a good life in that valley. My morning routine never changed. Coffee on the front porch at sunrise, checking the fence lines, tending to the small garden my late wife had planted before she passed. The simplicity of it all kept me grounded after losing her. This land was our dream together, and now it was my sanctuary. When the business opportunity came up in Dallas, I knew I would be gone for 3 weeks. It was a consulting job that would pay enough to fix the barn roof and maybe add that workshop I had been planning. I spent days preparing the property for my absence. I checked every lock twice, arranged for the mail to be held, and asked my neighbor Jake to keep an eye on things. The only concern I had was about Sheriff Karen Briggs. She had been causing problems around town ever since she got elected 2 years earlier. People whispered about her using county resources for personal business, but no one dared speak up officially. She had a way of making life difficult for anyone who crossed her. Jake had mentioned seeing her patrol car parked at different properties when owners were away. "Just keep your eyes open," he had said. "She thinks she runs this whole county like her personal kingdom." I locked up the house that Tuesday morning feeling confident. The security system was armed, the gates were padlocked, and I had left clear no trespassing signs visible from the road. My ranch was protected, or so I thought. The morning sun cast long shadows across my property as I drove away, completely unaware that I was handing my sanctuary over to a predator. 3 weeks later, I was exhausted from the drive home from Dallas. The consulting job had gone well, but I was ready to get back to my quiet life. As I turned down the county road toward my property, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the direction of my house. My first thought was fire. I pressed the accelerator harder, my heart pounding as I imagined my home burning down while I was hundreds of miles away. But as I got closer, I heard something that confused me even more than smoke. I heard laughter, music, the sound of people having a party. I pulled up to my front gate and could not believe what I was seeing. My property was full of people I did not recognize. They had set up tables and chairs on my lawn. Someone was using my barbecue grill, cooking what looked like steaks and burgers. Children were running around my yard, playing on the swing set I had built for my grandchildren when they visited. I sat in my truck for a full minute, trying to process what I was witnessing. This was not a mistake. This was not an emergency. These people were having a party on my property like they owned the place. I got out of my truck and walked through my own front gate, which was standing wide open. The lock had been cut clean through. As I approached the group of strangers eating and drinking on my porch, I recognized one face that made my stomach drop. Sheriff Corinne Briggs was sitting in my favorite patio chair, a beer in her hand and a plate of food on her lap. She was laughing at something one of her friends had said, completely comfortable and relaxed. When she saw me walking toward her, she did not look surprised or embarrassed. She looked annoyed. "Can I help you?" she asked, like I was the one who did not belong there. "This is my property," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing here?" Sheriff Corinne stood up slowly, her hand resting on her gun belt in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate me. "We are having a community gathering," she said. "Is there a problem with that?" I looked around at the 20 or so people who had stopped their conversations to stare at us. None of them looked like they felt guilty about being there. They looked at me like I was interrupting their good time. "The problem is that you are trespassing on my private property," I said. "I did not give anyone permission to be here, and I want everyone to leave. Now." Sheriff Corinne smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mister, I think you need to calm down and think about what you are saying. You are talking to a law enforcement officer." "I do not care what your job is," I replied. "This is my land and you need to get off it." That was when she pulled out her radio and everything changed. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Briggs. I need backup at 1247 County Road 15. I have a hostile individual threatening a police officer." I stared at her in disbelief. "Threatening you? I asked you to leave my own property." But she was already walking away from me, speaking into her radio with urgent tones that made it sound like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. The other people at the party had backed away, giving her space to handle the situation. Within minutes, I heard sirens approaching. 2 patrol cars pulled up to my front gate with their lights flashing and sirens wailing. 4 deputies got out and walked toward me like I was armed and dangerous. Sheriff Corinne met them halfway, speaking in low, urgent tones and pointing in my direction. I could not hear what she was telling them, but their body language changed immediately. They spread out and approached me with their hands near their weapons. "Sir, we need you to put your hands where we can see them," one of the deputies called out. "What is going on here?" I asked, raising my hands. "This is my property. These people are trespassing." "Sir, we have reports that you threatened a police officer," the deputy replied. "We need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back." I could not believe what was happening. Behind the deputies, Sheriff Corinne was still sitting in my patio chair, watching the whole scene unfold like it was entertainment. Her friends had resumed their conversations and were acting like nothing unusual was happening. "I did not threaten anyone," I said. "I asked her to leave my property. She is trespassing." "The sheriff has authority to use this property for community purposes," the deputy said, pulling out his handcuffs. "You are being arrested for threatening a law enforcement officer and interfering with official business." The metal cuffs clicked around my wrists as I stood on my own front porch, surrounded by strangers who were eating my food and drinking my beer. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. I was being arrested for defending my own property while the person who broke into it sat 20 feet away, laughing with her friends. "This is insane," I said to the deputy who was leading me toward the patrol car. "She cut my lock and broke into my property. She has no right to be here." "Sir, you need to remain quiet," he replied. "Anything you say can be used against you in court." As they put me in the back of the patrol car, I watched Sheriff Corinne stand up and walk over to my barbecue grill. She opened the lid and checked on the food that was cooking there. My food. On my grill. While I sat in handcuffs in the back seat of a police car. The drive to the county jail was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept thinking that someone would realize the mistake that had been made. Someone would check the property records and see that I was the owner. Someone would ask why Sheriff Corinne had been on my land in the first place. But nobody asked those questions. At the jail, they processed me like any other criminal. They took my fingerprints, my photograph, and put me in a holding cell with 3 other men who had been arrested for various petty crimes. When I tried to explain my situation to the booking officer, he just shrugged. "Talk to your lawyer," he said. "I just processed the paperwork." I sat in that cell for 6 hours before they released me on my own recognizance. When I finally got back to my property that evening, Sheriff Corinne and her friends were gone. But the damage was obvious. My lawn was torn up from all the vehicles that had been parked on it. There was trash scattered everywhere. Someone had left the water running in my garden, flooding the flower beds my wife had planted. But the worst part was the message it sent. Sheriff Corinne had claimed my property as her own, had me arrested for defending it, and then left it damaged and violated. She had shown me exactly how powerless I was against her badge and her authority. That night, as I cleaned up the mess they had left behind, I made a decision. If the system would not protect me from her abuse of power, then I would have to protect myself. The next morning, I started documenting everything. I took photographs of the damage to my property, the cut lock on my gate, and the trash that was still scattered across my lawn. I wrote down every detail I could remember about the confrontation, including the names of the deputies who had arrested me and the exact words Sheriff Corinne had used. My first stop was the county courthouse, where I requested copies of any permits or authorizations that might have given Sheriff Corinne the right to use my property. The clerk looked at me like I was crazy when I explained what had happened. "There is no such thing as a community use permit for private property," she said. If she told you that, she was lying. That was when I knew for certain that what had happened was not a misunderstanding or a legal gray area. It was criminal trespassing, breaking and entering, and abuse of power under the color of law. Sheriff Corinne had committed multiple felonies and then used her position to have me arrested for complaining about it. I spent the next week talking to lawyers. Most of them were reluctant to take on a case against the sheriff. They used words like difficult and complicated when they really meant dangerous for my practice. Finally, I found a lawyer in the state capitol who specialized in police misconduct cases. "This is clear civil rights violation," she told me during our phone consultation. "But you need to understand what you are up against. Sheriff Corinne has been in power for 2 years, and she has connections throughout the local legal system. The district attorney, the judges, even some of the state representatives owe her political favors." "So there is nothing I can do?" I asked. "I did not say that," she replied. "But we need to build an airtight case with multiple witnesses and documented evidence, and we need to be prepared for her to retaliate." That word stayed with me. Retaliate. I was already thinking about what else Sheriff Corinne might do to make my life difficult. False arrests were apparently just the beginning of her playbook. I started reaching out to other people in the county who might have had problems with Sheriff Corinne. What I found shocked me. There was a pattern of abuse that went back almost to the day she took office. Business owners who had been harassed with frivolous inspections after they refused to contribute to her political campaigns. Farmers who had been cited for violations that did not exist after they complained about her deputies speeding through their property. One story in particular caught my attention. A rancher named Tom Wilson told me that Sheriff Corinne had been using his property for target practice without permission. When he asked her to stop, she had his son arrested on drug charges that were later dropped due to lack of evidence. "She plants evidence," Tom told me. "My boy had never touched drugs in his life, but somehow they found a bag of marijuana in his truck during a traffic stop. The charges were dismissed when the chain of custody fell apart, but it cost us $15,000 in legal fees. As I collected these stories, a picture emerged of a sheriff who saw the entire county as her personal kingdom. She took what she wanted, punished anyone who opposed her, and used the law as a weapon against the people she was supposed to protect. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had targeted someone who had the time, the resources, and the determination to fight back. I was retired, financially stable, and had nothing left to lose except my dignity and my property rights. The investigation was just beginning. Word spreads fast in a small county, especially when it involves the sheriff. Within 2 weeks of my arrest, I was getting phone calls from people I had never met. They had heard about what happened at my ranch, and they wanted to share their own stories about Sheriff Corinne. The first person to contact me was Maria Santos, who owned a small restaurant in town. Sheriff Corinne had been demanding free meals for herself and her deputies, claiming it was part of a community policing program. When Maria asked to see the official paperwork for this program, Sheriff Corinne had the health department inspect her restaurant 3 times in 1 month. They found violations that did not exist, Maria told me when we met at a coffee shop 2 towns over. Suddenly, my permit was in jeopardy, and I was facing thousands of dollars in fines. I gave in and started providing the free meals. Then there was Frank Mueller, a mechanic who had refused to work on Sheriff Corinne's personal vehicle for free. The next week, his shop was cited for environmental violations, and his business license was suspended pending an investigation that dragged on for months. She cost me $50,000 in lost business, Frank said. By the time I got my license back, half my customers had gone somewhere else. The pattern was always the same. Sheriff Corinne would make an unreasonable demand. When people refused, she would use her connections in local government to make their lives miserable. Most people eventually gave in rather than fight a battle they could not win. But now we had something different. We had each other. I organized the first meeting at the community center in the next county over, far enough away that Sheriff Corinne's informants would not spot us. 12 people showed up that first night. By the third meeting, we had 27. By the end of the month, we had documented 38 separate incidents of abuse, extortion, and misconduct. The most important ally we gained was Deputy Mike Harrison, a 15-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department who had been passed over for promotion when Sheriff Corinne took office. Mike had been documenting her illegal activities for months, waiting for someone with enough courage to bring them to light. "She is destroying the reputation of this department," Mike told me privately after one of our meetings. "The good officers are either leaving or keeping their heads down. The ones who stay are either corrupt or too scared to speak up." Mike provided us with copies of incident reports that had been falsified, evidence logs that had been altered, and budget documents showing how Sheriff Corinne had been using county funds for personal expenses. He also gave us the names of honest officers in the state police who could be trusted to investigate without tipping off Sheriff Corinne. The media attention started small. A reporter from the regional newspaper wrote a story about my arrest, focusing on the unusual circumstances of being handcuffed on my own property. Sheriff Corinne dismissed it as fake news and refused to comment. But then Maria Santos went public with her story about the extortion scheme involving free meals. Frank Mueller followed with his account of the retaliatory business license suspension. Other victims started coming forward, emboldened by the growing coalition of people willing to stand up to Sheriff Corinne. The local television station picked up the story. Then the state newspaper. Soon, we had reporters calling from as far away as the state capitol, asking for interviews and requesting documents. Sheriff Karen's response was predictable. She held a press conference where she claimed that she was being targeted by criminals and malcontents who wanted to undermine law enforcement. She accused me personally of organizing a conspiracy against her because I was angry about being arrested for legitimate reasons. These people are trying to destroy the reputation of this department with lies and fabricated evidence, she said to the cameras. I will not be intimidated by their smear campaign. But the damage was already done. The coalition had momentum, the media had the story, and honest law enforcement officers were ready to testify about what they had witnessed. We were no longer individual victims being picked off one by one. We were a united force seeking justice. The town hall meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in November. The community center could hold about 200 people, and by 6:30, every seat was taken. People were standing along the walls and crowding near the back doors. I had never seen that many people gathered for a local government meeting. Sheriff Karen arrived exactly on time, flanked by two of her deputies. She walked to the front of the room like she owned the place, her uniform pressed and her badge polished. She had prepared for this confrontation like it was a political campaign event, with talking points and defensive strategies. The county commissioner who was moderating the meeting looked nervous. He had been in office for 12 years and had never dealt with anything like this. He started by reading a prepared statement about the purpose of public forums and the importance of respectful dialogue. Sheriff Briggs has requested the opportunity to address some recent allegations that have been made against her department, he announced. She will speak first, followed by public comment. Sheriff Karen stepped up to the microphone with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything in her life. She looked out at the packed room and smiled like she was addressing her supporters at a campaign rally. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, she began. It is unfortunate that we have to be here to address false accusations and malicious rumors, but I believe in transparency and accountability. She spent 15 minutes defending herself with carefully prepared responses that sounded reasonable to anyone who did not know the full story. She talked about the challenges of modern law enforcement and the difficult decisions that officers have to make every day. She accused her critics of trying to undermine public safety for personal gain. The recent allegations against me and my department are politically motivated attacks by individuals who have broken the law and are angry about facing consequences for their actions, she said, looking directly at me. I will not apologize for doing my job and enforcing the law fairly and consistently. When she finished speaking, the room was quiet. For a moment, I thought that maybe her polished presentation had worked. Maybe people would believe her version of events over ours. Then Maria Santos stood up to speak. Sheriff Briggs, you say you enforce the law fairly, Maria said, her voice shaking with emotion. Then explain why you demanded free meals from my restaurant and had me inspected 3 times in 1 month when I asked for documentation of your community policing program. Sheriff Karen's composure cracked for just a second before she recovered. That is completely false, she said. If you have a complaint about health department inspections, you should take it up with them. But Frank Mueller was already standing up. What about my business license suspension after I refused to work on your personal car for free? He asked. Was that enforcing the law fairly? The questions kept coming. Tom Wilson asked about his son's drug arrest. Other victims stood up to share their stories. With each testimony, Sheriff Karen's confident demeanor faded. She started interrupting people, accusing them of lying, demanding proof that she knew they could not provide in a public setting. That was when Deputy Mike Harrison stood up in his full uniform. "I have been a law enforcement officer for 15 years," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "I took an oath to protect and serve this community. What I have witnessed over the past 2 years has been a betrayal of that oath and a disgrace to this badge." The room went completely silent. Sheriff Karen stared at Mike like she could not believe what she was hearing. "I have documented evidence of misconduct, abuse of power, and criminal activity," Mike continued. "I have copies of falsified reports, altered evidence logs, and budget documents showing the misuse of county funds. I have turned this evidence over to the state attorney general's office." Sheriff Karen's face went white. "Deputy Harrison, you are out of line," she said. "You are suspended pending an internal investigation." "Ma'am, with respect, you do not have the authority to suspend me anymore," Mike replied. "As of this morning, I have been placed under the protection of the state police while serving as a witness in their investigation of this department." The room erupted. People were shouting questions, reporters were scribbling notes, and Sheriff Karen was backing toward the exit. Her two deputies looked confused and uncertain, unsure whether they should follow her or stay to manage the crowd. But she was not done fighting yet. The state attorney general's office moved quickly once they had Deputy Harrison's evidence. Within a week of the town hall meeting, Sheriff Karen was served with a criminal complaint charging her with multiple felonies including abuse of power, extortion, criminal trespassing, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The local news crews were waiting outside the courthouse when she arrived for her arraignment. She walked past them without comment, flanked by two expensive lawyers she had hired from the state capitol. But the confident swagger was gone. She looked like someone who had finally realized that her badge could not protect her from the consequences of her actions. The federal civil rights lawsuit followed 3 days later. My lawyer had coordinated with attorneys representing 12 other victims to file a comprehensive complaint seeking damages and injunctive relief. The lawsuit documented a pattern of misconduct going back to the beginning of Sheriff Karen's term in office. This case represents a systematic abuse of power that violated the constitutional rights of dozens of citizens, my lawyer told the reporters gathered outside the federal courthouse. Sheriff Briggs used her office as a personal weapon against anyone who refused to submit to her demands. The internal affairs investigation revealed the true scope of the corruption. Sheriff Karen had been billing the county for personal travel expenses, using deputies to perform work on her private property, and directing county resources toward businesses that provided her with kickbacks and favors. The financial audit was devastating. Over 2 years, she had misappropriated nearly $200,000 in county funds, equipment purchases that existed only on paper, overtime payments to deputies who had been working at her private security company, vehicle maintenance bills for work that was never performed. As the evidence mounted, Sheriff Karen's support network began to abandon her. The county commissioners who had backed her campaign started calling for her resignation. The deputies who had carried out her illegal orders hired their own lawyers and began cooperating with investigators. The plea bargaining process was pathetic to watch. Sheriff Karen's lawyers tried everything they could think of to minimize her exposure. They claimed she had been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of office. They said she had made mistakes in judgment, but had never intended to break the law. They even suggested that she was the victim of a conspiracy by disgruntled employees and political enemies. None of it worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, and the prosecutors were under intense public pressure to seek maximum penalties. The federal charges alone carried a potential sentence of 20 years in prison. In the end, Sheriff Karen pleaded guilty to 6 felony counts in exchange for a recommended sentence of 8 years in federal prison and restitution of $400,000 to cover damages and legal costs. She was also banned from ever holding public office again and forfeited her law enforcement certification. The day of her sentencing, I sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and shackles. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she stood up and finally spoke the words I had been waiting to hear. "I abused the trust that was placed in me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I used my position to harm the people I was supposed to protect. I am sorry for the pain I have caused." But it was too little, too late. The judge sentenced her to the full 8 years and ordered her to pay restitution to all of her victims. As the bailiffs led her away, I felt something I had not experienced in months. 6 months after Sheriff Karen was led away in handcuffs, I stood on my front porch with my morning coffee and watched the sun rise over my restored property. The lawn had grown back green and thick. The flower beds that had been trampled during her illegal barbecue party were blooming again, with the roses my wife had planted years ago. The county had paid for all the repairs and improvements as part of the settlement agreement. New security fencing, upgraded lighting, and a state-of-the-art camera system that would make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. But the real restoration went deeper than physical repairs. The new sheriff was a 20-year veteran from the state police who had volunteered to clean up the department. Within his first month in office, he had fired 4 deputies who had been complicit in Sheriff Karen's schemes and implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. "Trust has to be earned back one interaction at a time," he told me when he stopped by to check on how I was settling back in. "What happened to you and the others was a betrayal of everything this badge is supposed to represent." The civil lawsuit settlements had been generous. Sheriff Karen's personal assets were liquidated to pay damages, and the county's insurance covered the rest. But the money was never the point. The point was accountability, and the system had finally worked the way it was supposed to. Maria Santos reopened her restaurant with a new confidence. Frank Mueller's business had recovered and was busier than ever. Tom Wilson's son had his arrest record expunged and was accepted to college with a full scholarship. All of us had learned that standing up to corruption was possible, even when it seemed hopeless. The story had taken on a life of its own beyond our small county. Reporters came from across the state to write about the case. A documentary filmmaker was working on a project about small-town corruption. Law enforcement training academies were using our case as an example of how not to handle power and authority. Most importantly, other communities facing similar problems had reached out for advice and support. The coalition we had built became a model for other groups of citizens who refused to accept abuse from their local officials. I kept copies of all the newspaper articles in a folder on my kitchen table. Sometimes I would read through them and marvel at how far we had all come. From isolated victims being picked off one by one, to a united force that had brought down a corrupt sheriff and restored integrity to our local government. As I finished my coffee that morning and prepared to start another peaceful day on my ranch, I thought about the lesson we had all learned. Power without accountability will always become abuse. But when ordinary people refuse to accept that abuse and stand together for justice, even the most corrupt officials can be brought to account. Sheriff Karen was serving her sentence in federal prison, and we were all free to live our lives without fear of retaliation or harassment. The system had been broken, but we had fixed it. Justice had been served.